Recording is in progress.
All right, thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. Welcome to week 37 of our Indigenous Global Unity Summit event. As always, I want to start these events by doing a land acknowledgement. So I will begin by saying that we begin by acknowledging that we walk upon the traditional territories of Indigenous peoples. We recognize their history, spirituality, culture, and stewardship of the land, and we're grateful to all Indigenous groups for their commitment to protect the land and its resources. We're also committed to reconciliation, partnership, and enhanced understanding. We acknowledge the land we're meeting on here in the Greater Toronto Area is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Anishinaabe peoples, and is now home to many diverse peoples. We also acknowledge the land we're on as at the meeting place of two treaties, the lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit and those of the First Nations of the Williams Treaty. We thank them and other Indigenous peoples for sharing this land with us. We also acknowledge and recognize all of the world's Indigenous peoples as stewards of Mother Earth. So now I will share my screen. I should start my presentation first. Okay, just let me know when this comes up.
Yes, it's up now. It's
okay,
up now.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. My beginnings now, of course, as I had done in the last few weeks, include indicating some of the events that are coming up. In this month, we have coming up on Sunday, February 20th, is actually World Day of Social Justice. And so World Day of Social Justice on Sunday has been taking place since 2009. And it's celebrated on February 20th. The United Nations General Assembly adopted this resolution to recognize the day as an opportunity to remember that social justice is necessary for peace, security, and development around the world. Again, I will put in a link in the chat to this. Actually, the following day on Monday is also International Mother Language Day. Again, the UN International Mother Language Day observed on the 21st of February to promote awareness of linguistic and cultural diversity and to promote multilingualism. It was first announced by UNESCO on the 17th of November 1999, formally recognized by the UN General Assembly. Again, I'm linked to those two events that are coming up prior to our next IGU Summit event. So again, I always start this presentation by giving recognition to our supporters and sponsors, in particular Andrew Networks, which had been EdFu Foundation as our primary sponsor of the Global Unity Network, with the Zoom calls now continuing on through December 29th, 2023. So Andrew Networks rebroadcasting production-ready episodes on ad hoc International Advisory Board Goodwill Ambassador or AHIABGA.org domain, being redirected to the UCIT-TV site. So you'll notice the change I made a few weeks ago in our opening logo. Now with the Eventbrite page and the logo indicating that this is, of course, the 21 to 2023 IGU Summit event, acknowledging that we do plan to continue delivering this every Thursday until the end of 2023, again, in alignment with UN Global Compact 2021-23 vision and strategy. So again, I will put in the information about that strategy into the chat for everybody. You'll also see the logos on this page, in particular for the Maui Aloha project, the 5 Points Youth Foundation, the AHIABGA International Advisory Board, the Future Lift Foundation, the Global Women's Development Network, Global Peace Let's Talk, the Community Development Foundation, the American International Education Federation, the EDFU Foundation, and quite a few other ones as well. So again, in the chat, there are some links as we move forward for many of the organizations that we are partnered with. Importantly, though, Andrew Networks is our primary sponsor supporting this promotional ecosystem for the Global Unity Network Initiative through to December 29th, 2023. Andrew Networks donates our hosting and promotional support services. They are Andrew Networks brand and domain name owned by ParXDC Export Trading Company, which has various social media channels, including TRN TV, Universal Citizens Media Network, Conversations with Andrew Williams Jr., and many more. Again, in the chat are the links to Andrew Networks, who also founded the Ad Hoc International Advisory Board of Goodwill Ambassadors, Advocates, and Activists in September 2019. Our focus is on vocalizing sustainable development goals during this decade of action and delivery on the SDGs 2020 to 2030. Andrew did appoint me as Ad Hoc International Advisory Board representative for Canada, La Francophonie, and the Commonwealth of Nations countries on January 1st, 2020, later as a representative for Turtle Island last year. Again, the ambassadors, all of them can be found at the link in the chat. So as we move forward, I wanted to indicate or tell everybody, of course, that I am Lloyd Helferty, Chief Ecosystem Director, or CED, Program Development Director and Sustainable Society Consultant for Energime University, which is headquartered in Manhattan, in New York, in the US. I am located, though, in the city of Markham, in the Greater Toronto area, Southern Ontario, here in Canada. Energime University being a private company created to help empower global populations to reestablish a sustainable balance with their local environments. Energime does this by designing and implementing projects that support a strong and diversified local economy while integrating core sustainable technologies and infrastructure into local communities in the areas of renewable energy, high density food growth, managing local waste streams, and protecting local water resources. So Energime is supported by over 375 companies whose products and technologies we employ. We also support local education and training in the construction, deployment, and maintenance of these integrated solutions for achieving closed loop systems that support self-sufficient, sustainable communities. Again, my interest or my direct contact information is in the chat.
Lloyd, this might be an excellent time for to transition to WOPE, but depending on how many more slides you have, I'll let you continue.
Yeah, I was thinking after slide 9, I will take a break then. So just as an introduction, to let you know that I am co-founder and administrator of the We Energime Global Corporation Turtle Island International Civil Society Organization. We are seeking to undertake what we call life value peace education in the context, or delivered in the context of life learning gardens. So We Energime Global Corporation, again, that link that you see on the page is in the chat. As noted earlier, also designated Goodwill Ambassador for the 5 Points Youth Foundation in Los Angeles, with that portfolio covering Canada, La Francophonie. My computer is quite slow, sorry about that. It's not transitioning to the next slide. Oops. Something's going on. Okay. So the portfolio of Canada, La Francophonie, the Commonwealth Nations, and Turtle Island communities, as a member of the Ad Hoc International Advisory Board of Goodwill Ambassadors, activists seeking to empower our communities. There we go. To engage with Royal, Indigenous, and tribal leadership, as well as interfaith, neighborhood, academic, and business collaboratives, or INABC, which are seeking to leave no one behind. Again, for the chat, some links to the Ad Hoc International Advisory Board. There we go. So a little bit slow on my slide. I am also a co-founder of the Global Unity Business Group that came together as a coalition of small businesses in order to establish, manage, and grow this Global Unity Network. The Global Unity Business Group being this humanitarian enterprise and global sustainable and regenerative development corporation supporting and promoting the local delivery of open source, regenerative, climate smart infrastructure set up as life learning gardens, along with this hybrid virtual learning platform that we call the VCN, or the Interchange for Peace. So the Global Unity Business Group created in order to formalize a process of localization of global goals, of course, promoted by the Ad Hoc International Advisory Board, starting with the SDGs, being done by the establishment of this Global Unity Network, which includes, in particular, the Unity Gardens Network and the Unity Learning Networks, along with a large number of dedicated Unity networks, being all components of this network of networks, as we call it. So the existing social media, WhatsApp, Facebook, LinkedIn groups that we're using right now are being used as placeholders as we build this global network, prepare to launch, eventually get all of these people, all the companies, all the entrepreneurs, and everybody in our network onto this VCN, where they'll be able to gain access to the many tools and services that are available there, and much more easily collaborate in order to implement these globally coordinated projects. Again, I will put in information about the business group into the chat. So the Global Unity Network is being created to showcase global cooperation for the implementation of the local regenerative solutions for achieving the global goals, starting with those 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, with our goal being to uplift the traditionally marginalized communities that are mostly being left behind because the economic paradigm that we have is focused on making money for those who already are wealthy by extracting resources, typically through the exploitation of people in the natural world. Could I ask if people could mute themselves? Thank you. And therefore, the majority of people on Earth are being ignored, mostly by our existing highly competitive economy. So our focus is on the billions of people who exist or subsist on the economic sidelines, where we intend to start our work by delivering solutions for people and communities in some of the least developed countries, communities, and local economies that are in the most food insecure. So, and quick information into the chat. So the Global Unity Network is promoting the delivery of these practical solutions for achieving the global goals, starting with the Sustainable Development Goals. During this SDG period until 2030, we are focused though on 3 tools of humanitarian entrepreneurship, focusing mostly on female and feminist humanitarian entrepreneurs and enterprises, or FFHE, the hybrid virtual and hands-on educational training, the learning programs and platforms, our primary focus being on the delivery of this humanitarian entrepreneurship, skills training in practical settings, so practicum learning, along with leveraging these open source regenerative climate smart infrastructure solutions to remotely assist local INABC teams to establish the open source Unity Garden classrooms in all of their local communities around the world, with the Unity Garden classrooms set up in conjunction with existing schools in the local communities and used for the local remote virtual delivery of the practicum learning programs for those FFHE to learn how to grow, process, cook, market, sell, and trade the various types of regenerative climate smart food and related nutritional and medicinal and other types of locally produced regenerative products within their own local communities, as well as regionally, nationally, continentally, and even internationally, to produce income and greater prosperity for their local communities and for all the people on all continents eventually, with the intention and goal of leaving no one behind. So I put into the chat our Smart Cities Network group, which isn't very active right now, but we'd like to move forward eventually with that as well. I wanted to also say that we promote through the virtual social marketing all of the members of our network. We use these practical social media network and trade tools, and those of the modern fourth industrial revolution to combine wisdom of the crowds with especially the deep indigenous knowledge of our ancestors and the living indigenous people of the earth in order to learn from each other how to share the abundance of this planet in order to create productive, regenerative, climate-smart landscapes wherever we live in and around each of our own local communities. So the intention being also to help restore nature and biodiversity, enhance abundance for all, and ultimately restore the human connection to Mother Earth as proper stewards of our one and only beautiful planet. So this, I think, is a point where we can break off and provide an opportunity for our guest speaker to come on and give his presentation. Since this has been an introduction to the Global Unity Network, I can follow up later if we have time with the rest of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Lloyd. If you could stop sharing your screen, I'm going to briefly share the introduction to our guest today.
Okay.
I'm taking you now to the website for the World Humanitarian Organization for Peace and Equity. And you can find that at www.w-hope.org. I have to warn you, it's important that you put the dash after the W to make sure you get to the right website. Otherwise, you will be unduly surprised. However, as you can see, one of the objectives of WOPE is also to localize the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm pleased to announce to you that Chaplain James Mercy, James Mercy, has also been appointed in 2020 as an ad hoc International Advisory Board of Goodwill Ambassadors. So he is a part of our family as well. On the WOPE website, you'll see his photo, but you'll also see mine as the chairperson of the International Advisory Board for WOPE. So this is very much a collaborative effort between us. So Pastor James, I'm going to turn the mic over to you. Are you ready? Pastor James, can you hear us?
Thank you so much. I'm here with you. Greetings to everyone. Can you hear me, please?
Yes, you're a bit low, but we do hear you. Yes.
All right. Thank you so much for that. His Royal Highness Andrew Williams Jr. And I want to thank Lloyd AHIABGA-TV for this opportunity to be here. I want to thank everyone, Jamagasia, Stefani, Shola, and others that are here today. I say thank you for having me on board. I am James Mercy Obatumibi. I am a member of AHIABGA, and as well, I am the Chief Executive Officer of World Humanitarian Organization for Peace and Equity, and also a team member of this Global Unity Network. So today is a privilege to be here. So thank you so much. Please, Ambassador Lloyd, I would like you to give Mercy James as a co-host for me to share my screen, if that is possible, please.
You may share your screen. Go right ahead.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Sorry, please, I'm bringing that on board. The topic before me today is to talk about the community equity for the indigenous people. I would like to start with what community is. It's a simple definition as a unified body of individuals, such as the people with common interests living in a particular area broadly, a group of people with common characteristics or interests living together in a large society. Also, a community could be a body of persons of common and especially professional interests, catered through a large society. It's also persons or nations having common history or common social, economic, and political interests. These are the international community. Then a community could be a group like by a community policy, a common policy. That is when we have people that common policy governs, we can regard them as a community. And interactive population of various kinds of individuals coming together in the same location. So it could be regarded as a community. So I would like to quickly talk about equity. Justice according to natural law or right, specifically freedom from bias and favorism. When we talk about equity, because we want to talk about community equity for the indigenous people. So equity also is something that is equitable. Then it's also a right, claim, or interest existing or valid in equality. Trials or remedial justice under or by the rules and doctrines of equity. A body of legal doctrines and rules developed to enlarge, supplement, or override a narrow, rigid system of law. We are talking about equity here. So now, when we talk about the indigenous people, these are the distinct social and cultural groups that share collective ancestral ties to the land and natural resources where they live, occupy, or from which they have been displaced. The land or natural resources on which they depend are, okay, I will make it snappy because we have so many of them. Indigenous people often lack formal recognition over their land, that is their properties now, territories, and natural resources are often last to receive public investment in basic services and infrastructure and face multiple barriers to participate fully in the formal economy, enjoy access to justice, and participate in political process and decision-making. This legacy of inequality and exclusion has made indigenous communities more vulnerable to the impact of climate change and natural hazard, including the disease outbreak such as COVID-19 that we all experienced last year. Last year is still existing anyway. You know, vulnerable to the pandemic and exacerbated with the lack of access to national health, waters, and sanitation system. Then why indigenous people own, occupy, or use a quota for the world surface area? They safeguard about 80% of the world remaining biodiversity. They hold vital ancestral knowledge and experts on how to adapt, mitigate, and reduce climate and disaster risk in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, in an opportunity to walk through the traditional authorities and healers of indigenous people to provide accurate information to disease prevention. All right, we're moving forward.
Take your time, Pastor James. We've set this time aside, so take time to make your complete presentation.
All right, thank you so much. Now, the customary ownership, the lands, the resources belongs to the indigenous people because they are the rightful owners. Now, the customary ownership, much of the land occupied by indigenous people is under customary ownership. And yet many governments recognize only a fraction of this land as formally or legally belonging to indigenous people, even when indigenous territories and lands are recognized. Protection of boundaries or external parties' use of natural resources are often weak. Insecure land tenure is a driven of conflict, environmental degradation, and weak economic and social development. This threatens cultural survival and vital knowledge system, both of which contribute to ecological integrity, biodiversity, and environmental health upon which we all depend. Because this is also important when we talk about indigenous people. Now, indigenous people rights. Over the last 20 years, indigenous people rights have been increasingly recognized through the adoption of the international instruments and mechanisms, such as the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People in 2007, the American Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People in 2016, 23 ramifications of the Indigenous and Tribal People Convention from 1991, the establishment of the United Nations Parliament, a permanent forum on indigenous issues, UNPFLR, the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous people. All these are what's brought together indigenous people's rights. And the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous People. We must understand that if right has not been violated, there will not be a law or rights are claimed. Now, indigenous people are the United Nations. Indigenous people are inheritors and practitioners of unique cultures and ways of relating to people and the environment. They have retained social, cultural, economical, and political characteristics that are distinct from those of the dominant societies in which they live. Despite their cultural differences, indigenous people from around the world share common problems related to the protection of their rights as distinct people. So they find it difficult to protect their rights, to have their rights as distinct people. Then indigenous people then have sought recognition of their identities, way of life, and their rights to traditional lands, territories, and national resources. Natural resources for years. Yet, throughout history, their rights have always been violated. Indigenous people today are arguably among the most disadvantaged and vulnerable group of people in the world. We all know that, and that's why we have this program coming up. The international community now recognize that special measures are required to protect their rights and maintain their distinct cultures and way of life. Here is the demographical statistics. The United Nations estimates that there are more than 370 million indigenous people living in 70 countries worldwide. However, estimates of the total world population vary between around 250 and 600 million. Exact estimates are difficult to make. That's just the point. It's difficult to make because of the different way that indigenous people are identified and recognized in different countries. So it is very difficult to say categorically or vividly that this is the accurate number of the indigenous people, because we have them in their localities, we have them in their communities all over the world with different names or whatsoever. Now, the characteristics, according to the United Nations indigenous population, can be identified by a number of different characteristics. Indigenous refer to a self-identity, which suggests that an individual claims and it's claimed by a community. That is, each community claims who they are, or what they are, or what name they bear. A connection to a specific territory, the land, and the resources of that region. A connection to distinct culture, belief, spiritual practice, language, belief, and political system. The maintenance of distinct social identity, accessible environment, and cultural practices. Indigenous people is widely used term, but people in different communities or countries and regions may have their own preferences for how they want to be referred to. Number one, as others may be used, prevalently include, number one, we have tribe. So we have some indigenous people, they regard themselves as a tribe. We have First People. We have First Nations, Aboriginal groups. Countries or region may also have other specific terms for groups that live in those areas. In the United States, for example, indigenous people are often referred to as collectively as Native Americans. Through the research, they are referred to as Native Americans. Now, we have the international right here for all the indigenous people. International group also recognize the rights of indigenous population. Those rights are detailed in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, which was first adopted in 2007. When it was introduced for members of the United Nations, the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand voted against the declaration. While not considered law, the declaration outlined recognition for the right of indigenous people, including land ownership, and specified that states cannot relocate people without their freely given informed consent. It's part of the hindrance. Health. Indigenous population also often approach health differently than other Western cultures. Dominance. Mainstreams medicine views health in terms of physical symptoms and the treatment of disease. Indigenous approaches to health, on the other hand, often take a much more holistic approach and consider how physical, emotional, and spiritual factors contribute to health and well-being. Indigenous populations also face health issues that are often linked to the loss of their traditional practices and poor funding for health services. For example, includes increased infant mortality. Children begin to die here and there. Increased risk of diabetes and obesity linked to dietary changes. Poor prenatal care. These are the health challenges that indigenous people encounter or face. Then we'll just have to talk about this is coming from Africa. We have to talk about Africa. Indigenous movement in Africa. Africa has been late in joining the rest of the world in the indigenous movement. It was the persecuted, oppressed, and sometimes destroyed nation in the American continent that forced the so-called modern world to recognize the rights of indigenous people. The effort compelled the United Nations to launch action to safeguard indigenous people's rights in 1982 with the advent of the Working Group on the Indigenous Population. Now, in West Africa, it contains very militant people who, during the same period, took up arms against Niger, Mali, and Chad, so that their identity will be recognized in these young countries, born from colonization in the 1960s. These people are the Tuareg, the name given to the southern part of the Amazigh nation, which covers all the northern Africa. The Tobo and Udabe and the Ogoni of the Niger Delta in Nigeria. This about the history. The Tuareg and Udabe, Tobo are nomadic people in the Sahel countries, Niger, Mali, Chad, Algeria, Libya, and Mauritania. These are the African continent, resulting from Berlin Conference in 1885, divided these people among several different countries, the leadership of which favored those the other people, generally sedentary farmers who had a vision closer to colonialism, and when continuing colonial work since colonization, the suffering of the pastoral nomadic people has continued. Indeed, the configurations of the country do not take their specific political, geographical, and the cultural features into account at all. In forming these countries, the monarch component was difficult to control, and the solution was either to ignore them or to persecute them until the end. This is the way. And since then, each group has been trying to resist the steamrollers. They want to continue to exist as completely separated entity within their current countries, as they had done for thousands of years before the colonial phenomenon. The armed fight led by Tuareg and the Toubous in Niger and Mali since the early 1990s ended with negotiation under the aid of France and countries the sub-region. These negotiations resulted in peace agreements that provided for the man's aggressive recognition in government body. These agreements are being applied, yet the process is far from what we will consider satisfactory. The problem persists and have even become more complicated. For the moment, the battle continues on the political front to assist the democratic process in countries. History will tell us the rest. History is always there. Then we have to talk about the Ogoni people in Nigeria, as I've mentioned earlier. The Ogoni people of Nigeria are faced with the same constraints in a country that counts thousands of nations and of people, each with its own identity. The Ogoni are a minority, a circumstance complicated even more by the richness of the subsoil of their land, their own land. Their fight is still ongoing in Nigeria that refuses to recognize the legitimate nature of their aspiration. Opposing them is the machine of the multinational exploiting of oil in Niger Delta and a government primarily run by people who are the accomplices of these multinationals in crushing the Ogoni without world knowing. They have their land, they have the oil, they have the mineral resources, and all these things, because the government want to get them, they are destroying their lands. They have no land to farm. They have no land to build house. So they are really facing serious challenge in that Ogoni here in Nigeria, because the indigenous are really suffering from that. Okay. Now, the human rights of indigenous people, because they all have their right. The human right of indigenous people and people are explicitly set out in the ILO Indigenous and Tribal People Convention, number 6169, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and other widely adhered to international human rights treaties and declarations. They include the following indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated human rights. The human right to freedom from any distinction exclusion, restriction, and preference based on their indigenous status, which has been purpose or effect on impairing the enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedoms. The human right to freedom from discrimination in access to housing, education, social services, healthcare, and employment. The human right to equal recognition as a person before the law, to equality before the court, and to equal protection of the war. That is, indigenous people has this right. The human right of indigenous people to exist, they must exist, they mustn't be eradicated. The human right to freedom from genocide and ethnic cleansing. Human right continues. The human right to livelihood and work, which is freely chosen, and to subsistence and access to land to which they have traditionally had access and relied upon for subsistence. The human right to maintain their distinctive spiritual and material relationship with the land, to own land individually and in community with others, and to transfer land rights according to their own custom. So they have all these rights to do all this. Also, human right to use, manage, and safeguard the natural resources pertaining to their land. The human right to freedom and association. The human right to enjoy and develop their own culture and language. The human right to establish and to maintain their own school and other training and educational instructions, and to teach and receive training in their own languages. So they have rights to have to own school and have their teachers teaching in their own language, in their own dialect. The human right to full and effective participation in shaping decisions and policies concerning their group and community at the local, national, and international levels, including policies relating to economic and social development. The human right to self-determination and autonomy over all matters internal to the group, including the field of culture, religion, and local government. Then, now I want to talk about government commitment or their involvement, because as a government, they must respect the rights of humanity, and they have the right to. Indigenous people have the right to the full and effective enjoyment of all the rights and fundamental freedoms. Indigenous individuals and peoples are free of equal to all other individuals and people in dignity and right, and have the right to be free from any kind of adverse discrimination. Government should understand this, and they should give that right and respect to the indigenous people. Indigenous people have the collective and individual right not to be subjected to ethnocide and cultural genocide, including prevention of or redress for any action which has the aims and effect of dispossessing them of their lands, territories, and resources. Government should take note of that. whenever they just go to any land to acquire it, they must know that the indigenous people have right to their own properties and their culture. Indigenous people should not be forcibly removed from their lands or territories. Indigenous people have the right to be secured in the enjoyment of their own means of subsistence and development, and to engage freely in all their traditional and other economic activities. The government should put this into consideration, and they must understand this. We have several examples to put in place, because when government, let's assume they want to have their road done, they just go with caterpillar, clear houses. Some they don't want to care who owns the properties. But this is telling us the right of the people. They have their rights to their properties, and government should know that. Even if you are doing such a thing, you have to compensate them. You have to call them. They must be aware of all this before the action is being carried out. Conclusively, brethren, indigenous people have the right to maintain their distinctive spiritual and material relationship with the land and other resources which they have traditionally owned, occupied, or used, and to uphold their responsibility to future generations. Indigenous people have the right to full recognition of their laws, traditions, and customs, land tenure system, institutions for the development and management of resources, and the right to effective measures by states to provide any interference with, alienation of, or encroachment upon these rights. Indigenous people have the right to the restitution of the lands, territories, and resources which they have traditionally owned or otherwise occupied or used, which has been confiscated, occupied, and used or damaged. Indigenous peoples have the right to determine and develop priorities and strategies for the development or use of their lands, territories, and other resources, including the right to require the states obtain their free and informed consent prior to the approval of any project affecting their lands and their resources. I think I've said that earlier. If government has to do anything that has to affect the land, the territories, the resources, the development of the indigenous people, they should be called, they should be notified, they should be informed, they should sit around the table, they should be aware for them to know what to do and how to prepare themselves and how to safeguard what they have. So it will not lead to any war, chaos, fight, that will not lead to any problem. So because they have right to their properties, they have right to development, they have right to be aware of anything that may want to be done to their properties. So I would like to say thank you very much for listening to me. I have to say thank you very much for inviting me here. And I believe this is not going to end here, because we are not just talking, we want a change from every individual, from government, from organizations, to help the indigenous people have their rights back and to be able to treat with equity. So there will be peace in the land. There will be peace in our nations. There will be peace in our communities. So thank you so much for having me on board. Thank you.
And thank you very much for that presentation. That was, I think, important for all of us to understand the context of which we are doing our work here in the Global Unity Network ecosystems that we are building here. I guess at this point, what I can do is I can continue either my presentation, or we could have an open discussion and we can continue later. I'd like to actually get Andrew's feedback on what he thinks we may be able to do at this point.
Well, actually, Lloyd, we have a few hands raised, so maybe there are some questions from the audience, but after that, perhaps you can complete your regular presentation. But now's the time, perhaps as an interlude, to allow there to be questions and comments about what the presentation was just held. What do you think?
Yeah, actually, I was thinking at first I would just continue my presentation right away, but I am seeing the hands up, and I think there may be questions on people's minds at this point for James to answer. So let's go to Ayodele. He does have his hand up, and we'll have him ask perhaps a question of James. Go ahead, Ambassador.
Okay, thanks for this wonderful presentation from our presenter, that is in the person of yes, that is Mr. James Obatumibi. Now, this is my question, because when you about especially some of this presentation that talk about the indigenous right, especially fighting for their right, and especially in the area of their personal belonging. You made an example of Ogoniland. If you remember that because of fighting for the right of indigenous, that was one of the reasons why Ken Saro-Wiwa was killed. Now, because you know that this is an Africa that when you say that, when you think that you are fighting for your right, you can be confronted by the government, you can be put into the prison, you can be killed, either sending an assassination to you or do any kind of anything to you. But now, this kind of presentation, how possible it is, long are we the indigenous right? Then how soon can we really get it right in Africa, especially to stop for the government to stop the victimization of the indigenous, taking over their rights with gun, with with violence, intimidating them with one thing or the other. Because I think we still have a very long ways to go, and I think this is one of the things that because when we are talking of the UnityNet Africa, we are looking at what can connect us together as an Africa. And because the majority of the people that are the UnityNet Africa are the voice to the voiceless people. So what can we do, especially to promote some of the things that you are presenting today, to make it as one of our major campaign in the UnityNet, without offending the government and without violating the law of the land? So thank you, and because it's not a presentation that we can just conclude like that and push as things to. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. For that question, it shows that you really follow us, and I do appreciate that. So, Ambassador Ayodele, what I would say is traditional rulers, like in Nigeria, for example, we have Obas, we have emirs, we have the Obis, the Igwes. They should be the one to advocate for culture, for the indigenous people. But it's very unfortunate now that everything has been turned to politics. I remember in those days, before you can pick or choose the next king to be on the throne, you have to follow the traditional way, the culture, for you to appoint any king in those days. And it's always be on the safer side. It brings peace to the community. But now, things are not being done that way. I have seen several kings that have been appointed by a state governor, which it wasn't ever like that from ages. So they have turned on even the traditional programs, the traditional or the culture to politics. That is where the mistake, the problem is coming from. And those politicians are in the government. If you run to your king now, instead of the king to support the indigenous people, the culture, the tradition, they would like to support the government because his appointment to be a king is a political appointment. So that's why we have really got it wrong. There's no, I'm using Nigeria as an example, for heaven's sake. Like in Nigeria now, if you have any issue with your properties, with your land, what they tell you is to go to court, customary court, to appeal or to do anything. And do not forget that those people in court, they are government officials. Will they be fighting themselves? So that's another problem that the indigenous people are facing. If government comes to your land and say they want to use this place, move away from here. You go to court. In the court too, most of the judges there, they are on political appointment from the government. They want to secure their seat. This is where corruption is coming in. What I think the indigenous people should do, it is for them to come together as a unified body. The indigenous people as a unified body with a ruler who can advocate for them. If they come together as a unified body, even if the government is appointing somebody over them, they will speak. We don't want such person. We want our person. But because they have been individual, fighting individually, it will not work. But coming together as a unified body, having the association, having it as a group, even the government will be afraid to just bite on them. Will be afraid to just, do anything to violate their rights. That is just my humble suggestion. If you have your properties, if government is troubling or disturbing you, the best thing you could do is to go to court. Because even the police, do not forget, their government officials. Because most of the problem the indigenous people face are from the government.
Thank you so much, Chaplain. And in respect to the people that we have left that have questions, perhaps the questions could be just a minute or two and your answer can be just a minute or two, but we do have other hands raised.
I think I'm done with that.
So Ganga,
I'm done with that.
Ganga, please go ahead.
Hello, good evening. It's almost midnight. It is 11 o'clock at night.
Thanks for joining us. But tell us who you are first, introduce yourself, and make sure you put your contact in the email. Go right ahead, Ganga. Thank you.
Okay. Great. I'm Ganga Awal from Nepal. And I represent indigenous people of Kathmandu Valley, one of the oldest indigenous population. And it is really heart-touching, the presentation, and very fruitful. And it's useful and are similar to most of the developing countries. And I have been advocating for women's rights, women economic empowerment, as well as to address climate change issues. And as Lloyd know, most of my activities, we've been working in high mountain area in Nepal to combat poverty, food insecurity. And especially we have been working on sustainable agriculture for food security projects since 2070s, formally and informally from 1990s. And a lot to do again. And we're doing constructing biogas, environment-friendly cooking, clean cooking in high mountain, smokeless stoves, biogas, and much more related to environment-friendly, climate-smart agriculture and food production. And in terms of indigenous people, of course, as all indigenous people have already lost ownership and control over their ancestors' lands and territories and resources, many of them are living in poverty. In Nepal also, illiteracy, education, and lack of food security. So I would like to share about here, although we have 35.80% of population are indigenous people in Nepal. Although Nepal government has ratified many international instruments of human rights, of them, one of the most significant ones are adaptation of United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP in 2007, and ratification of Convention on 169 International Labour Organization, ILO, and International Convention on Civil Political Rights, 1991 International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and Convention on, of course, elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, CEDAW, in same year. But the most important thing is, one, if government is very good in ratification of treaties, conventions, and declarations, but the problem lies with its meaningful implementation, always. So we are worried and watching and working closely with the government, although it ratified, although it's made promises, but when it is in implementation part, indigenous people are always left behind, and women are left behind. And although government has rules and they have constitution, Nepal government constitution, they provide 33% of women participation in all levels. So women, indigenous people, all in one place. So in the name of indigenous people, for example, if they have to bring in decision-making level, if they have to bring women, they leave behind indigenous people, because in indigenous people, women, Mauritius, they are in same categories. So always with indigenous people, they don't get the opportunity, a meaningful opportunity in decision-making levels, even if it is mandatory, and if they have to bring, they just bring, just for count the indigenous people, how many indigenous people, how many women, how many, but it is not meaningful participation. So this is the problem. we have been facing, we have been struggling, we have been fighting for indigenous rights. And the farmers, indigenous farmers, they have land, they have been working. For example, I have same story. My grandfather has been working in land. We have been producing our vegetables and grain, but the land document paper, legal paper, we don't have. It's been 100 years we have been tilling that land, but we don't have the land document. So it's not belongs to us. And the landowner is someone else. So it's after 100 years, even we could not get that land, although we have been tilling it. And we have been requesting government to provide that land, even 50% of that land, we would be happy. Because if it belongs to someone else, so we have rights to get that 50%. Because who dig the land, so we have to be, it has to be rights of ours, the farmers as well. So we're not getting it, and we've been fighting against it for many years. So this is the problem in, I think, most of the developing countries, least developed countries. And I also feel that if one person speaks, no one listens. If group of people, of course, the integration, I agree with the previous one. If we integrated together worldwide, here, nationwide, in national level, local level, international level, together, so we can get the justice. Thank you. Almost, I would like to say good night.
Thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it. Love you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I would like to listen. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I have my hand raised, but Mohammed, you had your hand raised before. If you have a comment, otherwise I'll make my comment. Mohammed, the ball is in your court. Okay, Erwin, I see your hand, but let me interject mine because it was raised first. This is Andrew Williams Jr., and I do want to commend each of you for your participation in making this Indigenous Global Unity Network something more than just a conversation piece. However, there are several important underlying facts that I think we need to take into consideration. One, it is true that the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that act was passed back in 2007, but for the United States, for example, we only took the time to acknowledge that in 2009. So there is, in fact, a lack of participation at the government level. However, there is something called the United Nations Permanent Forum for Indigenous Peoples. So I recommend that we do, in fact, use our group here as the ones to do an outreach to connect together with those existing frameworks through the Indigenous peoples worldwide. And in particular, for those of you on the continent of Africa, August 2nd of last year, there was United Nations resolutions that formed the Permanent Forum for People of African Descent. So I recommend that we work together with this new organization and with the older one, but we cannot overlook a very important element of all this we're discussing, and that is what's called the diaspora. In many cases, when you think of the diaspora or when you hear of it, it speaks about the diaspora here in the United States, for example. Many of us here are of African descent. So we're considered what the African Union calls members of the diaspora born outside the continent of Africa. However, each of the 55 African countries, or most of them as I understand it, have a specific division for dealing with the diaspora from those separate countries. For example, Nigeria has a commission dealing with that. One of our goodwill ambassadors, Shola Agbula, is a member of that, although he is here in Canada. What I'm recommending is that we take the responsibility, human right number 29. You gonna be able to go? I'm ready. And be the ones that engage the diasporas from each of our countries with those people on the continent. But that's the same true of Nepal and all the other countries, including throughout Asia. that your diaspora represents those people outside of your country. They are, in fact, distributed throughout the world. In many cases, the remittances from the people in the diaspora do more for the local community than all the foreign aid combined. And even in spite of the illicit money that goes out through these Western countries. So I'm just encouraging us as a group, ourselves, take responsibility ourselves, do what we can ourselves to pull together and work together. Now, with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, there are 17 goals and 169 targets. That's a lot. Before that, the Millennium Goal had 8 targets. But underlying that, the reason why we're convinced that the United Nations Global Compact might be a smart way to go is because they deal with very simple and direct principles dealing with human rights, including indigenous rights, labor, the environment, and anti-corruption and transparency. So our commitment is to bring another 10,000 new members of civil society to that organization so we can, in fact, have a seat at the table instead of being on the menu. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for reminding us of that. As I'm listening to the conversations and the presentation earlier today, I think it's so vital that we actually concentrate so much of more of our efforts on the Indigenous Global Unity Network and expanding that network, working with people like Gemma and the cultural networks, and working with our allies in all countries, on all continents, especially, as you say, with the diaspora. As you know, I've been also working with people here in Toronto, for instance, in the Philippine diaspora as well over the past few years, trying to connect those. And to now the conversation I have recently is to connect Canada with India in a global network, hopefully to bring together the Indian diaspora, especially as well here in Canada. So working locally with the Indian diaspora to try to support the initiatives that we are undertaking through this network. I guess Mohammed did have his hand up earlier. Did you want to say something, Mohammed? If you can unmute yourself. If not, we can go to Irwan.
Hello.
Oh, well, okay, so go ahead, Mohammed.
Yeah. Good afternoon over here. Good evening over there. I'm very happy with great enthusiasm for me to. I was sorry to come late because So I want to say thank you very much, Mr. James, and those that have given their comment. We are also having the same challenges here in West Africa, Guinea, to precise. We have the indigenous people who are not given the will or the chances to participate in terms of governance. So their lands they are not having access to their lands. For example, like what Madam just said here. My father has a land of which we don't have the legal document because our father never went to school. So we didn't have the document. So now they don't give us rights for us to get access to the land because we have a very vast land of which we normally do agriculture. But we are looking forward in order for looking right for the indigenous people. So I want UnityNet to be put hands together to help us fight to eradicate that, because our fathers never went to school, so they don't know the value of a document. But for us, the youth, now we have found it that it is very important for someone to have a document to prove that you have a land or you have something, because anything that you own, you need to give a proof. You need to make a document to prove that it's owned by you. But our fathers who did not go to school, we are having a very, very difficult challenges in Africa, especially Guinea here, because they are working with people who normally go to these areas vandalize those lands and took it from the indigenous people and make it on their own use without giving a valid reason, even having good or resources from the land, without giving or sharing even a single percent to the landowners. So this is the challenges that we are encountering now. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. So, Irwan, did you want to go ahead?
Yes, basically, I would like to ask some questions to Mr. Jem, Dr. Jem. I'm planning to do some proposal for some pilot project, mainly in Africa, maybe in Nepal and some other countries, a pilot project. But in that project, I'll be attaching requirement that the project be done under transparent program, whether it is funding, whether it is spending, whether it's budgeting, and so on, so that it can be monitored. So the fact that we are dealing maybe with the indigenous people, maybe more closer community, or maybe even somewhat isolated. I'm not so sure I should say isolated, but they are maybe within themselves, in relatively small location, maybe 1 or 2 village. Do you think there will be? Are we against the current at this point in terms of having this type of arrangement where maybe it is from perspective of stakeholder, maybe it is desirable for everybody to know where the project are, the target, whether being achieved or not. So I just would like to have you comment about this. I developed this transparency practice, in effect, trying to prevent corruption. Thank you. Oh, can everybody hear me?
Yes, of course. Thank you so much. It's so interesting, and of course, great idea if we could do something together.
Yeah, maybe Nepal will be one of the area that.
Yeah, we are interested to work. We are interested to work, especially this.
Yes, we can hear you. What we have been sharing. Please go ahead, Please go ahead, madam.
Yeah, we would like to do some collaboration for empowerment of indigenous people globally. So if we could do something, so it can be transfer the knowledge and technologies around the world.
And also transparent in terms of the whole progress, monitoring, and so on, right?
Of course, that is the main thing, transparent.
So Ganga, I will invite you to the Women in Feminist Network so we can have a conversation directly with Irwan after this.
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, also, as you are talking about the African, yes, we know that the issue of corruption is a pandemic in Africa, which I believe that is not only in Africa because it's becoming a general phenomenon. So doing things with the right people is what gives you the right result. By the grace of God, with the kind of institution that we are trying to establish in UnityNet and being monitored and supervised by some of the UnityNet Africa and Diaspora, we are believing that in whatever we are going to do or to handle, there's going to be a transparency, because the approach which we are trying to use is the number one. We agree of using a bottom approach, from bottom to the top approach, and at the same time, the purpose of UnityNet is to see how we can do better, especially in the area where some of the old organization and the government has failed. So that is why our constitutions and our the article of association is still in the process and scrutinizing that, so that any investors that is coming either to work, do anything in Africa, passing through the platform of UnityNet, that organization will not be able to be disappointed. So I believe that we can shed more light on this, maybe in a different occasion. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Ayodele, for that as well. I think, I'm not sure if Carlos is on the line today or not, but Carlos has been emphasizing this with me as well for quite a while, that he would like to leverage, especially the continental network, UnityNet Africa and Diaspora, sort of as a filter to make sure that that corrupt practices are not inflicted upon the individual local members of the network. So this is the idea of coming together, similar to the way we can come together through the Indigenous Unity Network as well, to prevent exploitation at the local level. So did you have any more comments there, Juan? Did you get your answer met? Your
no, Lloyd.
Yet?
I think I think it'll be great that if we can somehow try to implement this process.
Mm-hmm. Well, I could put you in touch with James afterward if you want to discuss with him directly.
Yes,
if you're not yet connected to him.
Yeah, with everybody who might be interested in that aspect. I guess Andrew mentioned about one of the compact program is anti-corruption, so they might be fitting into that category. Thank you.
Yeah, so it is actually a very, very useful conversation, I think, to have with regard to anti-corruption, because we have not really put in that much effort in that particular realm through the Global Unity Network at this point. So I'm also seeing Juliet has her hand up. Perhaps she'd like to make her own comments as well. You're muted. Yeah.
Yes, no, thank you. Good evening, and thank you, Professor Lloyd, Andrew, and thank you for the presentation, and also the comments, including the ones from Erwin. I just wanted to highlight, I think it is always interesting that the rights of the indigenous people, especially in a country like South Africa, where we have the majority of the people in the country are the indigenous people whose rights have been trampled on for many years. So in fighting for human rights, we then find that the human rights of the indigenous people is that at times there's an issue of conflict in terms of the rights of children and the rights of women, in terms of possession of land, in terms of early marriage. I mean, there's a culture of Ugutwala, which is protected a lot by a lot of indigenous cultures. That culture says if a young girl is walking to the river and a man spots her, he has a right to take her and then marry her and send cows to the family. I'm just summarizing it. But that's one of those topics that are very dynamic and are spoken about in the social media space, and are contested against the constitution of the country. So I'm just highlighting that in some of the projects that we are proposing, we always find that we have to work very closely with the chiefs. I'm answering Erwin's question, that we don't just work as organizations, but we stay in contact with the chiefs, we stay in contact with all the tribal rulers to actually explain how what we do is in line with the constitution. At times they're not comfortable because it disturbs some of their cultural or patriarchal ways of doing things. But then what happens is the constitution of the country then protects the work that we do. So that also applies in issues of transparency, in issues of corruption, in issues of fund management. So we have to work and look at everything else, and more than anything else, bounced against the laws of the country that protect both the Indigenous people, but also the vulnerable communities. So it's in environments like ours, it's always a catch-22 situation where you have to respect the Indigenous, the rights of us as Indigenous people, and also where you have to have the rights of us as women and children and the elderly being protected. I'm just throwing that out there to make you aware that the work is very intense, but we do work closely with the communities and the chiefs, and we negotiate. I saw Her Royal Highness Princess Steffi was on. I don't know if she's on, because maybe that could be something that she might want to comment on, because it's always a balancing act, but protected by the Constitution of the country.
Oh, thank you very much, Juliet. So Juliet is one of the sort of people that I have been working with recently, especially with Irwan, to see if we can get some pilot projects going at some point, especially in South Africa, possibly Uganda. Perhaps we're thinking about now in Nepal, but of course that will be up to Irwan to decide ultimately, because this is his proposal to undertake these projects. To initially begin to demonstrate these Unity Garden solutions, plus the process of localization that we have developed through the Ad Hoc International Advisory Board, to have ongoing interaction with these communities. So we would like, of course, in the meeting tomorrow I mentioned earlier, will be to discuss if it's possible we can do a twin project here in Canada at some point, as well, with our counterparts in Africa and Asia, so that we can really demonstrate these solutions that we are promoting and we have been developing over the past really 2 years since the beginning of this pandemic, and even before that, are useful to communities in really helping to bring them together in solidarity. Not just at the local level, but worldwide, as we build these networks that will help empower those people that are at the grassroots level, whose voice isn't being listened to. So actually, before I continue my presentation, I'm hoping that Stephanie will be able to say a few words about what she's been up to recently. She's come back from Hawaii, where she's been probably having some very interesting moments there with I think as well Indigenous people on that island.
Well, thank you, Lloyd. Thank you for giving me the time to say hello to everybody. My name's Stephanie Schuler, and I'm in Toronto, Canada. I did just get back from Hawaii, United States, where we have a global eco-village initiative called the Maui Aloha Project, which is about focusing on food and housing security, and also social and emotional community well-being. Really, it's about going back to some of the old ways and the old wisdoms of living in community, in a village, and sharing all of the responsibilities and the joys of a community. While we were there, we had continued the global tree planting for peace and reconciliation, and planted a kukui nut tree there, which is symbolic of light and enlightenment. And they're too trying to bridge the relationships with the Hawaiian Indigenous people and the rest of the people who are in Hawaii right now, and trying to bring up rights and equity and opportunities, and to change right now I'm in my final year of my doctoral studies in education. And you see that I put a link into the chat box to everybody regarding WIPSE, the World Indigenous Peoples Conference on Education, which I attended a few years ago in Toronto, Canada. I think that, you know, we're frustrated with governments and we're frustrated with leadership. And I think that a real place to begin, you know, begin change is in education. Begin change, you know, education has been totally colonized as well, colonialized, and you know, where there's prescribed curriculum of what has to be learned by all. And I think it's an opportunity for those of you who are on the call to take a look at the WIPSI conference that's coming up in Australia. That's going to be online. And we need to start changing the conversation, as we said, for, you know, women and children who don't have any rights in so many parts of the world. I know that the Indigenous population represents 15% of the world's population. So my angle is to make changes in education so that children can learn from young ages, in particular about food security and food systems, that children can be exposed in all parts of the world. And that's what the Unity Learning Network is about. Children can start to be exposed to seed to table processes so that they can be empowered and they can grow into becoming you know, community leaders and family leaders of their own households, and they'll have the knowledge and they don't need to rely on others for their food security, which of course is a huge topic. So it was very successful in Hawaii. Of course, the conversations between all groups are a little bit mistrusting, but because of the past, you know, 100 years and more. And we're really garnering those relationships and trying to glean from the Indigenous and cultural wisdoms of the world regarding climate action and our sustainable well-being. So it was really a wonderful opportunity to meet with Hawaiian leaders and also all kinds of county leaders as well, and bridge those relationships. So thank you, Lloyd. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Andrew.
Sorry, I was muted as well. Thank you very much, Stephanie. I think it's very important that we have these conversations, especially also here in Canada, and perhaps use Hawaii again as the bridge to Asia, as that crossroads of the Pacific, as we had talked about before, as we are leveraging as well our friends in the Atlantic as the crossroads of the Atlantic in Bermuda, to have these conversations with people in Africa as well. So Juliet, did you have any further comments? I see your hand is still raised. I'm not sure if it just you had not lowered your hand or if you had further comments.
It's an old hand. It's an old hand, sorry. I'll put it down.
No problem. So did we want, actually, I'm looking at the time right now. I'm seeing I have about 40 minutes. I can probably continue my presentation. I did have a few extra slides from today as well. So
yes, I would Lloyd, that you do complete your presentation. I want to thank everyone for joining us. And for those of you that do want to stay, yes, Lloyd, I think it's important to complete your presentation. I'm going to stop recording now just so we'll be able to upload this segment, and then I'll start recording again.
Okay, perfect.